Hello everyone, welcome back to Music Chat. We are going to finish our trilogy today of studying people and music that had to do with children. And in this case it's going to be about a man who influenced music in the schools and in the churches in a way that I think is long-lasting and very profound, and his name is Lowell Mason, and we're going to talk more about him as a just what he did in his life as opposed to even the music that he wrote. You'll find out, we'll talk about, he was a hymn writer, and he wrote I think 1,600 hymns, something like that, and many are hymns that you would know and recognize. But rather than talk about a particular hymn of his, we want to talk about himself. And yeah, him, yes.
I know.
And anyway, Barbara and I have both been reading some articles about Lowell Mason, and let Barbara tell us a little bit about why we chose him.
Right, and we want to go back to the fact that he was such an influence with William Bradbury, who we had talked about earlier. And it turns out that he influenced probably every music educator, every church musician, and still does.
Right.
As a scholar of music education, we always started out by studying Lowell Mason because he was really considered to be the first music educator in America.
Right.
So that's a big deal. So that's why we were focusing on him. Plus, we do sing a lot of his hymns still. And as you said, there used to be a lot of them in the hymnal, but they've kind of been dwindling a little bit just because of the time, because he was born in 1792. So he's been around for a long time.
Right.
And his work was in the middle of the 1800s, and was born in Massachusetts. He kind of was a self-taught musician, but he came from a family of musicians. So he taught himself to play instruments and whatever. And then he was always interested in it. So he would seek out people that would allow him to study composition and study singing and that sort of stuff. And so he had quite a background in that. By the time he was 16, I think he was the organist at his church, and choir director. And in his early 20s, he moved to Savannah. And they're not really sure why, but probably for a job or whatever. And he decided, he wasn't going to be known as a musician. That probably was not the thing to be known as. So he had a dry goods store with a partner, and eventually, started working in a bank just to kind of have a living. But he never gave up his music studies or interests or anything like that. And when he was in Savannah, he actually studied with a man whose last name was Abel, who was a German immigrant, and he studied composition with him. And that's important because it really influenced the European way of harmonization and of composition, the tradition of Mozart and Bach and Handel.
The classical era.
The classical era of musicians really influenced him in his writing. So
he was basically living in the classical era.
Yeah, he was.
Yeah,
they were almost contemporaries,
That's right.
And so that was, although he was not able to travel at that time, he traveled later in the 1800s. But definitely he was influenced by them, which comes out in his writing a lot of the ways. And as he continued in Savannah to study and to write music, he took Abel's hymn book and used that kind of as a basis to write his own. And they took it to publishers to see if it could get published, and nobody wanted to publish it.
Right.
But finally, the Handel and Haydn Society decided to publish it. And I think it's interesting because he didn't want to put his name on it because he didn't really want to be known as a musician.
Yeah, it sounded from what I was reading like maybe that might put his job in jeopardy.
Exactly.
If they thought he was
Doing something else.
really had his time on this over here instead of his job or something, yeah.
But the irony of it all is that it was a huge success.
Right.
So here this wonderful book of hymns and whatever that he wrote, and nobody really knew that he wrote it, you know? So that was kind of a cool thing.
Yeah, and I guess this collection that lived on for a long time. It was hymns that he wrote, and I will say right now that we really found that he was not the lyric writer of all these many hymns that he wrote. He was the music writer.
That's right.
And so when we say he's a hymn writer, we don't mean the lyrics, we mean, in this case, we mean the music. Part of it. And so he wrote many hymns of his own that were in this work that became so important to the churches. And he also took many of the hymns that the European writers had written and kind of edited them and really brought them to America, I think, probably is what it sounded like. He was so influenced by the European traditions.
Well, and before we leave him being in Savannah, I do want to say that while he was there, he was always very interested in children and educating children. And he opened the first Sunday school for black children in America.
I have not read that.
Yes, which I think is really significant. And he was the founder of the Savannah Missionary Society. So that really shows you another side of him and makes all the other stuff much more understandable, that he always had that desire to help children and to educate children. He stayed in Savannah for a while, and once this book was published, this collection, he became really well known. I mean, it became so popular that he was able to go back to Boston, and he was actually the music director in 3 different churches.
Right.
And played the
Apparently he wasn't a banker or a dry good guy after that.
No,
It seemed like
he did it for a while. He did it for a while, but then he realized he wanted to take full time to compose and to educate children.
Right.
So that is good for us because he fought to get the Boston public school system to put music in as a core subject in their curriculum. The first time he did that, he didn't go very far, so it was kind of tabled. But then eventually he was able to do an experiment at one of the private schools there, and it was so successful. And in fact, he and a couple of his other colleagues opened a music school to just for any student, not just the talented ones, not the privileged ones, but any student. And it was so successful the second year they had 3,000 students. So between that and having his program kind of experimentally put into a private school, they finally accepted him as an authority and accepted his ways. And the Boston public school system put music in as a core subject. And he became the supervisor of that.
Yeah, he, well, before he became like the music supervisor, what we call today, he founded the Boston Academy of Music.
That's what I was talking about, right.
Which was the first of its kind, where, we think of conservatories of music in places where you only study music. Well, that was unheard of at this time.
Right.
This was the first place that that we had that, and so that was a significant development. And while he was associated with the Boston Academy of Music, and I should say he founded it with a partner. I think he wasn't the only one.
It was a couple of people.
Yeah, right.
Colleagues, right.
But the whole time he worked in the school system, became the music superintendent there, and in the Boston public schools and whatnot. He developed teacher training methods,
which is so cool.
Yes. He was heavily influenced by, and probably nobody cares, but I recognize his name from college, studying the history of music and history of education. There was a Swiss educator named Pestalozzi, Johann Pestalozzi, I believe his name. And he was one of the first philosophers that had the idea that you don't just teach facts. It's not just about learning a set of facts and right, but that you work on the heart, you work on the hands, you work on the mind. You know, it's all you work on the total child. And it seems obvious now because we've had that in our school system for many years, but that wasn't done then. It was all facts and memorization and rote learning. And so our man, Lowell Mason, was very influenced by Pestalozzi, and he brought those ideas into the public schools in Boston. And so he spent the rest of his life really developing hands-on teacher training, helping teachers to learn how to do that style of teaching. He started, we were talking earlier about, he started what we call now music conventions. Yeah, and I don't know if that's what they were called then, but it was once a year you could go and have a 5-day week where you had professors and teachers teaching teachers how to do different methods and
also performances. And we talked about the fact that that's what we do. I mean, as music educators, I know your whole life and my whole life, that's what we've done, is attend conventions, hear choirs singing, hear instrumental groups performing. The fact that it's a performing art just lends itself perfectly to that kind of thing, and we've continued to do it all these years.
That's right, and he was, the whole time that he had this interest in the school system, he was still doing all the church music as well. Very involved in getting children's music in the church as well, So there was church and school were, as we've said before in some of these talks, church and school were pretty closely related, at this time, and so there was a lot of going back and forth between, the same person that's your Sunday school teacher might be your music teacher at school and that sort of thing.
And at this time, there was not the music education in the schools, so that's where the children were singing. And he was, and the philosophy is that every child can learn how to read music and can be taught music. It is not just for the talented. It is not for the elite. It is every child. Which is something that has been carried through forever. And without him, maybe somebody else would have taken on the goal of
well, I hope
doing
somebody
that.
would have, but he certainly gave us a great foundation. Well, he knew a lady. Her name was Sarah Hale, I believe was her name. Do I have that right?
I think so.
And Sarah Hale was she was also a Sunday school teacher and somebody who was interested in children. And she was interested in literature, bringing literature to children in school. So she wrote poems. And he urged her to write a poem for children, and she did. And it was what we know today as Mary Had a Little Lamb. And so at that time it was called Mary Lamb, I think, and then it became Mary's Lamb
or something.
And it has a whole story too, which we won't go into that. We started unearthing this Mary Had a Little Lamb part of the story here with Lowell Mason, and it turns out that there probably was a real Mary who really did take her lamb to school, and so there the story goes. But anyway, she wrote this poem that became part of one of the first literature books for public schools. And then maybe a year later, he took that one and maybe some others, I don't know, but he set the poem to music. And so the merging of music to this point, Mary Had a Little Lamb, started with Lowell Mason and Sarah Hale. And we still, of course, have it today. But I just got such a kick out of seeing the piece of music, the original way that it was written. And I asked Barbara if she would sing it for everyone, just a very short, and we'll only do one verse of it. You know, Mary's Little Lamb has a long, it's a long story, but we're just gonna do the first verse that's so familiar. But we want you to hear how he harmonized it. She'll be singing the melody, which isn't what you think it's gonna be. It's gonna sound like an English little song.
I think of Mozart. I'm sorry. I just really think of Mozart.
You may be right, yeah.
Because of his influences, you know, because I think he had that influence and he put a lot of notes in there. And it's very different than...
Yeah, it's very classical sounding. And but it's very short, but I just thought it was so interesting. And I'm going to play the harmonies as he wrote them. So on the sheet music that we found on one of the sites, it was this old looking piece of yellow music that, that had a soprano part and an alto part and then a bass line.
Yeah.
And so then that piece, that Mary's Lamb, was in this first book of songs that he compiled that became the first children's songbook.
And there were many other familiar ones in there, but this one is pretty cool.
Right, and I think that's so remarkable because, I mean, we, as music educators, have seen many music series in our lifetimes. And, but there was a first, and this song was in it. It was Lowell Mason and Sarah Hale. So we're going to sing and play Mary's Lamb.
Oh my.
Do our best here.
If I can sit and put all the words in with all these notes, we'll do the best we can.
Let me see if I should probably play off of this one here. Okay, so I'll give you a little introduction.
Yeah, please do.
I mean, poor Barbara learned that like 5 minutes ago. But
sorry, it's not well practiced, but maybe you'll get the idea.
But I couldn't resist asking her to do that because I got a real kick out of that. On my little sheet, the article that I have that had the music on it, it came from. It was a whole book about the development of children's literature, but in that kind of caption that went with the picture of the music, it said that Lowell Mason, the founder of institutionalized music education in American public schools, believed that singing had a happy influence upon the feelings and manners and morals of the rising generation, on whose character the future destiny of the country depends. And so for this reason, he urged fellow Bostonian Sarah Hale to write her book of poems for children, and then a year after it was published to allow him to put Mary's Lamb to music for the first time. From that moment on, the poem and the music that accompanied it would be inseparable. And so it became part of the first songbook published in the United States, intended for use in public schools. But that little quote about he believed that singing had this happy influence, and Pestalozzi, had the philosophy of you teach the heart and the hands and the mind, but everything.
That's right. It is not just teaching music notation or whatever. It is the fact that these children are going to become great musicians. It is the fact that music helps to make children, it completes them.
Yeah, and I mean, this is so early, and we know now, we have the benefit of research
Right.
that tells us that what music helps. Music helps math, music helps science, music helps your kinesthetic ability. So, you know, we have all the brain research that
Right.
says how important music is. And this was somebody who didn't have the benefit of knowing all of that from research, but just knew it
Knew it in his heart,
inherently that this is a good thing.
Yeah.
And it's why we have school music. It's why we have church music. It makes us more complete, as you
Yeah,
said. More complete
absolutely.
people.
It's important to remember that for sure in these times.
Yes, indeed. So, what else do we need to say anything more about him?
The only thing I'm going to say is this little quote that was from a biographical sketch that appeared 10 years after he died, and it was called The Song Friend. That was the title of it. And this person writes, many people not personally acquainted with Dr. Mason fall into the mistake of attributing his success to a happy combination of circumstances, as the profession of music offered a comparatively new and unoccupied field of enterprise at the time he entered it. You know, it was a virgin territory, so to speak. The truth is, Dr. Mason would have equally distinguished himself in any profession. He was not a great musician, perhaps in the technical sense. He was not a great singer, player, or composer, but he was a great man. He had that keen, logical, and analytical quality of mind which enabled him to go to the root of things. He saw that all genuine reform must begin at the foundation. And he was a leader, obviously, and he loved music, and he loved children.
He is thought of as two things: the father of music education in America, but he's also considered one of the fathers of American hymnology. Yeah, and so he really had both hats on his whole career. I just kind of an aside. He later in life, after he had been many years in the school system, he opened up an organ company. And his son later, if you've ever heard of Mason Handel pianos, that's the family. His son, who was also named Mason, of course, became the Mason of Mason and Handel
so fascinating.
pianos. And so, it started out as an organ thing. And Lowell Mason was involved in the making of organs for churches and whatnot. So,
yeah, it's always amazing to me how far-reaching a person's life can be.
And like we're just going through our lives, and just like reading that, I'm like, oh my gosh, I've seen Handel Mason pianos many times in places. Just
it's fascinating.
and then you don't realize there's this connection, and all these.
And I'm going to link on to one thing that you said. He not only was very intent on trying to educate all children about music, but also in the church venue, he really wanted to raise the level of hymn singing in the church, and to bring that idea again of the whole congregation singing and being able to look at the hymn and being able to read the music, because before then they had just had shape notes and things like that. So he really felt like it was important to raise that level of understanding in the church setting as well.
Yeah, that the church singing belonged to the congregation. Yes, not just
not to people up front.
People getting paid.
Exactly. So that's important for all of us. That
he's the common man's musician, I think. So good addition to our little collection of people that we've been chatting about the last few weeks.
And maybe now someone in the congregation, when we sing a hymn, might look down there at the bottom and see who has written it.
Right.
I hope that happens, because
it's happening to me.
Yeah.
From our chats, it makes me more locked in on.
And you don't always know who it is,
So-
but every once in a while you
Right.
might see them. Fanny Crosby, Lowell Mason,
That's
William
right.
Bradbury.
Yeah.
Interesting. So just that awareness kind of makes it connect.
It does, and these hymns came from stories, inspiring
Absolutely.
stories.
Yeah, really cool ones.
And so we're going to do 2 of Lowell Mason's hymns for you, and I don't think we even need to say what they are because
they'll know.
I just think you'll know
Yeah, definitely.
them. And so we're just going to do one right after another, and just a verse of each one. These are 2 of the most famous, but he had many.
He had many,
including
sure.
Joy to the World, which we're not doing.
Yeah.
He wrote the music for that.
Many more rounds, songs for children.
Right.
Many
Yes, yes
more.
indeed.
We only touched a little bit of the surface.
Right. Thanks, Barbara.
Yeah.
And for everybody watching, we'll see you next time on the Music Chat. And not sure who we're talking about, but tune in and we'll find out.